Welcome to another episode of Rediscovering Conservatism, a webcast series that engages with some of the freshest thinkers on the European right. The series is jointly sponsored by New Direction Fundación Civismo, and for this episode, we're delighted to have with us Frank Furedi, who is a leading sociologist and an emeritus professor at the University of Kent. He's also one of the most prolific really authors in the field, and some of his recent works just in the past 4 years include Populism and the European Cultural Wars, How Fear Works, Why Borders Matter, and we would really encourage folks to head over and check all of Professor's work. But most recently, Professor, you've published back in October, and this will be the focus of our conversation, a fascinating book with the title, Democracy Under Siege, Don't Let Them Lock It Down. So I wonder if we can maybe get started with you walking us through some of your thought processes, how the idea for the book sprang, and maybe we'll delve somewhat deeper into how you see this apply to the current politics.
Well, I think the idea for it began a year ago, 2 years ago, when I was doing so. Sorry, excuse me.
No problem.
I was doing some lectures in Holland, and I ended up doing a debate in the Bali Institute in Amsterdam. And the debate was about populism, and I was there basically to defend Brexit because people in Holland couldn't believe that a sociology professor could be so ignorant as to support Brexit rather than the other side. And I was talking about democracy and its vital importance in people's lives. And when I finished speaking, this guy put up his hand and he said, "Surely, Professor Furedi, you're not saying that democracy is valuable in and of itself." I was a little bit taken aback, and then I realized what he meant was that as far as he was concerned, democracy was only useful, only good, if it got the right results. But if the wrong people got elected, then there's a problem with democracy. And when I answered the guy, I said, look, I actually think that democracy is good in and of itself. It's got an inherent normative value. He kind of looked at me shocked, as did some members of the audience. And then I realized that this was a very interesting reaction, and that perhaps this reaction was more widespread than I had imagined. And as it happened, I had spent a bit of time traveling around different bits of the world. And I'd also noticed that every time I go into a really big bookshop, like there's a massive one in New York on the Fifth Avenue, you go in there and you see piles and piles of nonfiction books. A very large number of them have something negative about democracy. Democracy, is bad, against democracy, why democracy creates a crisis. So I got the impression that there seems to be this new elitist hostility that has developed, which essentially reflects a massive distrust in the people, on the demos, their alienation from the temper of everyday life. And therefore, from their perspective, democracy, rather than being a positive asset, a way of life, was something that they'd want to confine and limit, and maybe in some cases eliminate. And that's really how the idea for the book began, because having been born in Hungary in the Stalinist era, having been brought up in that kind of environment where you have no freedom, no rights whatsoever, I've always been 100% committed to democracy as something fundamental, foundational for getting on with life. I think there's also another reason why I wrote it, which has got to do with some of the issues you're interested in with conservatism. See, I think that historically conservatives have not taken democracy very seriously. Certainly in the 19th century, they kind of regarded it as a curse, as creating a lot of problems. But what they never realized, and even now, a lot of them still don't really appreciate it, is that I would rather trust the demos, the people, in terms of their affiliation and their commitment and their association to the legacy of the past, to the foundational values of tradition, to the foundational value of having an organic link with your ancestors, to the foundational values of loyalty, duty, responsibility, patriotism, I would rather trust the people to uphold those values than the kind of cultural elites that think democracy, is really not very good. That's something really, it's okay as a process, but not something that's good in and of itself. And I think that conservatives need to realize that for conservatism to gain any significant cultural foothold in Western society, to be able to contest Netflix, be able to contest Hollywood and that kind of American soft power, they need to rely on democracy to be able to fight back and effectively.
Well, this is such a good way to kind of to get right into the heart of what you're arguing, and the reason I really wanted to maybe start with your thought processes, and I would really encourage folks to read your foreword where you explain the kind of the moment where the idea for this book sprang with the talk you gave, and then I imagine the idea was sort of brewing in your head for a while, primarily with Brexit and some of the years that followed. And what I found very interesting in the book is that you've a lot of the ideas in it kind of start as a reflection on populism, and there's the ongoing discussion over whether populism in itself is more of a unsavory sentiment that bad people can tap into to affect bad outcomes, or if it's in itself a healthy corrective when the elites become unaccountable, right? But beyond that sort of question, it seems like you started peeling off this question, and what the rock that you hit at the bottom of this is, as you've just said, a question about democracy. And you realize that, the kind of the left liberal progressive consensus on cultural issues that now dominates our politics is not really interested in democracy in itself. As you explained at the start of the book, they see it as a means to deliver good policies that they can deem good. And when that mechanism does not work as they intend, then they turn against democracy. I wonder maybe if we could develop a little bit more your fundamental case for democracy. Why it is important to have a system that gives people a say and that apportions power evenly across the demos, as you say. There's so much. There's so many interesting chapters in your book, but maybe delving slightly deeper into that, and then we'll try to apply it to.
Yeah, I think that I really discovered democracy again at the time of Brexit, and the reason for that was very simple, because until Brexit, a lot of ordinary people where I live tend to be fairly passive about politics, and felt that this wasn't really their conversation. In fact, many of them felt that they were being excluded from being part of a serious conversation. And they rightly felt that very often they were being looked down upon by people who felt that they were superior in some shape or form. And I've always been disturbed by that. I always believed that the wisdom of the masses, as Machiavelli said, was far more precious and more reliable than the wisdom of the individual ruler. So what I did was I began to think about it. And I remember just realizing, I went around during the Brexit referendum talking to people and going to meetings. And I realized that suddenly people were coming up to me and saying, Frank, until now, it didn't really matter how we voted. Where I live, we always vote conservative, and therefore my ballot doesn't make a difference. Or where I live, we always vote Labour, and I know in advance what the outcome of that election is going to be, and therefore voting is something you do, but it doesn't have very much of a consequence. We're not really excited about it. But with Brexit, people said for the first time we knew that the way we voted actually made a difference. And something happened, because the moment that people begin to think that their vote counts, they change. They become much more serious. They take themselves more seriously. They embrace a kind of sense of responsibility that beforehand they never really thought about. Their passive side becomes much more muted and they become much more active and argumentative. And I think that kind of sense of being argumentative, I say, is being very, very positive, because being argumentative, being open to the idea of expressing yourself is a vitally important dimension, both of individual human development, but also for a community to recognize one another. It's really, really important. In fact, for me, one of the biggest tragedies with the way that our democracy works is that millions of people usually self-censor. We find that in the United States, where people lie when they're being asked who are you going to vote for. And if you're a conservative, or you're going to vote for Trump, you will fluff the question and not really answer honestly. People are just, worried. And even in universities, well, especially universities, self-censorship is very, very strong. But if you can somehow get people to open their voice or find their voice and interact, then the political culture changes. And I think that's very, very important, because when you begin to live that way, you not only have a much more vibrant, intellectually and morally rich society, but the community itself somehow becomes elevated. And one of the things I wanted to write about in the book is that if you go back in history, you'll find that the most exciting moments in our history, in the history of Western civilization, are usually at times when society is more open to freedom, more open to democracy. And I begin with Athens, which is really where you have not just simply the discovery of democracy, but a very vibrant risk-taking culture. It's where reading takes off. People read for the first time. Culture takes off in a way that is, amazing. I mean, the kind of art and culture that develops, 2,500 years ago is astounding. And then you kind of move on and you'll find that, in Renaissance Italy, in the city-states, you have this humanistic outburst that's very, very powerful, a much more democratically oriented world than anything else that has gone on beforehand. And so on and so on, as you go forward to 19th century Britain, where you have the Industrial Revolution, but you also have far greater availability of democratic rights, not complete, but far greater than anywhere else in Europe. And to me, those kind of high points in Western culture are very often associated with the fact that people can live democratically, they can live freely. And I think that to me was a very important lesson to transmit to young people, particularly the younger generation, but also to other people here in the 21st century.
Yeah, and this is really interesting how you've I think you've responded there in a way that that's very appealing to conservatives, and that you ground your view of democracy in a sort of view of human nature, and the idea that democracy, at the end of the day, is also a certain way of engaging the citizen, and it rebounds in so many positive ways. And what we've seen before the populist upsets of 2016 and theretofore is that there was a sense of alienation, and as you explained, people really came to not valuing the vote, the actual power they can wield over the political process. So that was a really good way to get started. And there's another aspect of your argument that I found really interesting, and it seems like you speak of Brexit and perhaps to a lesser extent some of the continental European forms of populism. You've also written a whole lot about your country of birth, Hungary, but you seem to you've seen in Brexit and European populism a manifestation of something that goes back a lot further. At some point in your book, you speak of the late 60s and early 70s as the moment when liberal democracy becomes elitist, insulated, where the mechanisms are laid out for the elites to duck accountability, to be able to affect policy without the sort of accountability that democracy entails. And I wonder kind of what's your thought process there? There seems to be a whole lot of history packed between the 60s and our time. How did we get to this point? And maybe your book again springs from Brexit, but you've written a lot about the EU as well recently. How do you see the EU as the EU is in a lot of ways the manifestation of a lot of the trends that you described, the anti-majoritarian, anti-democratic attitudes, the skeptic attitudes towards democracy. So maybe unpack some of that for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the tragedies that occurred after the Second World War is that although it was recognized, especially after the Nazi experience, that we needed to have democracy, there was a lot of worry about what that democracy would mean. And certainly a lot of Western cultural leaders wrongly assumed that democracy was to blame for the rise of Hitler, never understanding that Hitler was never elected into power democratically. There was a coup, in effect, a coup d'etat in Germany that allowed Hitler to kind of gain power surreptitiously. But that's by the by. So anyway, the way they responded to this concern they had with democracy was to create a system of insulated democracy. And what insulated democracy means is essentially to outsource political authority to other institutions that are not accountable. So you have a tendency to outsource political decision-making to international institutions. And in the last 50, 60 years, the number of international institutions with significant controls and power over what happens in a nation state have expanded. IMF, the World Bank, the World Health Organization. But the EU is a very good example of this, where very often the EU makes laws that are made in Brussels, but not in London or in Paris or in Madrid. And that becomes seen as being a way of avoiding to take responsibility for making a decision within the nation state, but also not to have to worry about popular pressure on you. Another way of displacing authority somewhere else is by what I call the process of Derivification, where you basically give the courts, especially constitutional courts, a phenomenal amount of power to not just to interpret the law, but essentially almost to make the law and to play a very active political role. And the third way in which this is done is by the sacralization of expertise, the way that experts are given this incredibly sacred role. They become deified as if they're like gods. And we can see this in the pandemic, where very often politicians say, we follow the science, in the way that theologians would have said, we follow God, that kind of subservience, which basically means that in the current epoch, politics has become medicalized and public health has become politicized. So there's no line between the two anymore. So I became really concerned about this, because it basically means that the role of parliament, the role of elected sort of political bodies becomes very much emptied of its inner content, when so much of the important sort of decisions are taken out of it. And of course, it also means that the role of the citizen in being able to hold to account its leaders also becomes undermined. And I think that was, for me, a very important issue to kind of take up. And for me, populism was really welcome, because the way that I see it is not that populism is the last word in human civilization, that it necessarily is going to change the world for a better situation. What populism does is it basically signals the demand for a voice. What populism does, it also signals a demand for solidarity. What populism does, it basically says that at the end of the day, the common sense of ordinary people needs to be taken seriously. We very often know much better than you what needs to be done. And I was reasonably well trained for this, because I've written a lot of books in the past about something that's very close to my heart, which is how you bring up children, about parenting. And one of the things that I've argued for in my books is that a parent, a mother and a father, actually knows better the needs of their child than a so-called parenting expert. Somebody who's just kind of learned, got a PhD or a BA in psychology, has read all the books, but doesn't understand the instinctive signals that a baby or a child sort of communicates. And therefore, what I argue is that actually that kind of common sense that comes from life needs to be taken a little bit more seriously than we do. And expertise needs to be rolled back a little bit more to areas where it really does have a very important role to play. In other words, depoliticized expertise. So for me, populism was a way of kind of responding to these kinds of issues. And of course, the fact, just because populism has this positive aspect, it doesn't mean to say that it solves all of our problems, because it raises the question, what kind of sentiments, ideas, objectives that populism is going to embrace. And for me, one of the problems with populism at the moment is that it's still too immature. It hasn't yet grown up. It hasn't got the intellectual resources to be able to give its positive instincts a healthy, positive political direction.
That's such an interesting issue you raise there, and whether populism is bound to substantiate itself in an actual agenda for governance, or whether its destiny is just to evanesce after the signal has been sent. And I found that was also very interesting in your book. But I don't want to get into a rabbit hole, but I also find very interesting how you can apply the sort of the argument you develop in the book to the current predicament in the EU. I mean, you've mentioned you've given a couple of hints there, and you're obviously based in the UK. You've written a lot since Brexit. You observed that phenomenon very closely, and you're now very close to being a country that's no longer in the EU. But you in a previous book, you spoke of the European coastal wars, with specific reference to Hungary, and I wonder whether what you describe in your latest book isn't really playing out in the EU. I mean, we have the institutions of the European Union. For one thing, they were never designed in the most democratic of ways. That's something we've known for a long time. But also, it seems to me recently, and you've written about this, they've been co-opted by a certain political persuasion that also holds that sort of aversion to the demos. We've seen this with what happens when certain countries in the region of your birth, Central Europe, when the people elect governments that those institutions deem unsavory, that sort of anti-majoritarianism is going to be channeled in a lot of ways. We've seen that recently with Poland and Hungary, and the sort of the rule of law stance, which I thought also in a different way, but they also channel some of the trends you've described, politics becoming very legalistic, or the law becoming very politicized, however you want to frame the issue. But maybe give us your 2 cents on how you've whether you've followed some of what we've seen with the Commission wanting to, actually a coalition of countries within the European Council, EU Council, wanting to make COVID relief conditional on changing policies in Poland and Hungary. If you've followed that, is that a manifestation of what you were telling us in the book?
Well, I think it is. I think that there are a number of dynamics at work here. I think, first of all, what I call the European Union oligarchy has become extremely wary of what they see as the threat of populism. And in particular, they become extremely concerned about the challenge to their values, the way that they see it. And it's not that they have such principled commitment to those values, but nevertheless, they are, what they really are concerned about is when some values which challenge the raison d'etre of their existence are called into question. I think probably the most important value that is very rarely discussed explicitly that they don't like is sovereignty. I think sovereignty in all its forms, popular sovereignty and national sovereignty, is something they're very uncomfortable with, even though originally, when European unification was started, it was meant to be all about a diversity of nations. It recognized sovereignty, but at the same time, it attempted to reconcile, different national sovereign sort of projects with their own larger European project, and that was all right. I have no problems with that. What has happened is that although the European Union has remained committed to diversity, the one diversity it rejects is the diversity of nations and of national values. So you can, it's okay to have diversity in a multicultural sense, but not in terms of national sovereignty. That's forbidden. And therefore, underneath all these arguments and debates is whether or not governments have the right to be sovereign governments, making significant decisions about their lives. And I think what has happened is that, for better or worse, Hungary in particular, but also Poland, have decided that at the end of the day, their sovereignty was too precious to negotiate away. I think they've done that because they've lived under the Soviet Union for a very long time. Hungary has hardly ever been independent. It's been occupied by the Turks, by the Germans, by the Austrians, by literally everybody. And I think under those circumstances, your freedom is really something that is very, very important. So from their point of view, these values that are to do with sovereignty and their national legacies are seen as being particularly important, and they've stood up for them. And I think what the European Union has done is basically they have decided to teach sovereigntists a lesson by basically arguing that you are no longer allowed to determine, for example, what kind of family life your people should have. It's not up to you to decide sort of what a marriage is and what marriage isn't. It's not up to you to make it, to kind of simply argue that there's only a man and a woman in a biological sense. You need to accept our politics of gender. That is something that is absolutely necessary. And I think under these circumstances, what you have and what has emerged and what has developed is a situation where a kind of culture war has broken out. I think it's important to realize that the culture war wasn't started by Hungarians and Poles. The culture war was actually initiated by the oligarchs who used a technical, non-cultural language to promote it. And I think, as you alluded to this, their dishonest use of the rule of law is paradigmatical in this respect, because we all believe in the rule of law. What we don't believe in is where you make up the law as you go along, and then you say, well, we just decided that in fact a marriage must involve not just a man and a woman, but same-sex couple must involve all kinds of genders. That's the new law. It may be a law that's different than one that existed for hundreds of years, but that's the law now. That's the rule. And if you break it, then you break the rule of law. So that kind of petty, politicized way of using legal instruments actually violates the whole spirit of the rule of law. Because the classical liberal ideal of the rule of law, when you have a situation where you regard values as being something that you must control at an all EU level, then you are actually moving into this kind of soft totalitarian regime where you are, in a sense, determining how people should lead their lives, and even their very private, personal lives. And when you think about it, the very idea that the rule of law can be used by decision makers in Brussels to control and to manage people's personal lives, and where they can make pronouncements that violates the customs and the religions and the heritage of millions of people, then I think that we're moving into very troubled waters. And I think that I often thought about, I couldn't really quite understand, why are they doing this? Because at the end of the day, they could very easily have said, well, these are Hungarians, they're funny old people, these are Poles, they're not that important. They could have just, sort of diplomatically, sort of moved on. But I think that the reason why they made such a big fuss about this whole business of linking the provision of finance with values is because they know that when, for example, someone like Prime Minister Orban talks about the traditional way of life of Europe, there are millions and millions of people throughout Europe who think in a very similar way. You know, there are millions of people in Italy, in France, in Spain, I mean, throughout Europe, who are instinctively, you know, sort of just as much frustrated with these new Brussels-created values as Hungarians are. And I think it's a way of censoring that and kind of keeping it checked that has led to this one-dimensional focus on trying to punish these two East European countries.
Yeah, well, I think that's so interesting on so many levels, Professor, because as you said, you know, I think one of the things that we are finding out is that if the EU tried to delve a little deeper into the specific particular psyche of Hungarians, and them just being one example, I think you can find others, because I do not think they're interested in actually the level of understanding that would allow you to understand where these things come from in the kind of way that you do in your book about cultural wars. But if they did that kind of work, you know, they would unearth a lot of really interesting elements of that psyche, the pricing of self-determination, the ability to chart a national course as a nation. And I thought it was so interesting. You blended so many important points there. I do think, as you said, that more and more Europeans are realizing that, hey, this model of an EU, I mean, the paradox, isn't it, is that in a country like Hungary, where I know you left early on in the 50s, right? But we've often come to hear from Poles and Hungarians that you know, 1989 represented a watermark. It was a very important point in the national history. But then the EU has evolved towards a situation where where it's reminding them of an old situation where a lot of where stuff is being imposed from the outside. And I found that point so interesting. But I think it also invites your argument from the book, which is democracy. I mean, we're seeing. This is fundamentally a democratic problem at heart, right? Is that you've got an oligarchy, as you call it. I think it's a pretty strong word, but I'll use that word. They distrust. They're very skeptical of what a majority of people in some member states can turn into policies. And I thought, you know, that the issue of the rule of law conditionality kind of blends together a lot of interesting points in your book. And I wonder, you know, maybe just to delve deeper into maybe some of the issues specifically that you can, again, you're writing from outside of the EU now, but are there specific issues that you can think of as being a battleground between pure democracy and elitist democracy? Do you mostly think about environmental policy? Do you think about immigration? Do you think about, you mentioned some of the social issues that I found so interesting. Hungary just passed a couple of days back a constitutional amendment that enshrines into law what, you know, sort of the traditional understanding of marriage. But what kind of policy areas do you have in mind when you argue about democracy?
Well, I mean, in principle, I think just about anything that's to do with people being able to express their inclination, which is very often one that is contradicted by the way that experts or the way that particular institutions see them. So for example, there are battlegrounds that have not yet crystallized that I think are going to be very important. I think the issue of conscience is one area which is becoming really quite important, where people can live and work in accordance with their conscience, you know, when they have certain values. I mean, particularly if you got deeply held religious values, you very often are at an odds with some of the new kind of measures that have become, that kind of have been brought in. And the extent to which you can challenge or fight on those grounds is going to become, you know, I think really quite important. But I think that, you know, the way that I see it is that some areas are much more easy to resolve within the EU. Like you mentioned, the environment, and there's a kind of environmentalist obsession that has developed within the European Union. It's one of the ways in which the EU bureaucracy tries to legitimate itself by saying we're very green, very friendly, and all the rest of that, as a way of overcoming its legitimacy deficit. Because that's an area where I don't think there will be major conflicts. But the areas, where conflicts are likely to erupt are ones that are challenging national cultural sensibilities. I think migration is one such issue, where there are very different attitudes towards migration, and the very fact that the EU insists that a society that's heterogeneous, that's diverse, that's multicultural, is superior to a society that's homogeneous, which is what its dogma is going to become and is already a very important battleground, because for some people, it simply, doesn't make very much sense. I always remember when I was involved in the European Union network of researchers, and they came to this village where I used to live about 15 years ago. And these people are walking around my village where I'm living, which is near the university, and they're saying, "My God, it feels very, very strange in your village." I said, "Why?" He says, "All I see everywhere are white people." And I said to him, "Well, that's very interesting you say that. If you're walking around in a village in Botswana or Kenya, would you also say, oh, this is very interesting. I don't really understand it because all I see are black people in this village." Because the whole point that why should it be strange that in an English village in the countryside you only see white people, unless you think that it should be an equal number of black people, of Chinese, of this minority, of that minority. And what they were really saying, in effect, is that this village is morally inferior to a place which is kind of culturally diverse. So when you have those kinds of different ways of looking at things, that's got a very important consequence, because I've got no problems with living next door to a black person or a Chinese person, to anybody. I'm quite I'll be as good a neighbor as they are. We'll get on really well. But what I do object to is when people say that unless you live in that kind of context, that kind of environment, you are somehow morally inferior. You're not as good a person. And when they try to impose those kinds of values to do with nationality, culture, that's an important battleground. And I think the most important battleground of all, and we can see this in Hungary and Poland, are the cultural values of the American elite that are being imported on an industrial scale into Europe. I mean, all you need is for trans culture to be invented in California, 6 months ago, before people embrace it in London and Amsterdam and Stockholm, a few weeks later. And then that becomes seen as being a sacred, unquestioned, beyond debatable kind of value. And I think, when those things are being promoted, which do, frazzle and provoke people's anxiety, that too, I think, is going to be, and that is already a very important battleground. And I think that it's going to be interesting to see, how that kind of plays itself out, and which, how the different national governments, are going to line up and deal with this.
Yeah. Well, this has been a really such a wide-ranging conversation. I think we've unpacked so many different facets of what you describe in your latest book, Democracy Under Siege. Don't let them lock it down, and such a good COVID-19 kind of metaphor. But I would really encourage folks to head over and to their local bookstore and online and get a copy. And we're so thankful for your time, Professor, and for discussing some of the themes of the book. And thanks for watching this latest episode of Rediscovering Conservatism. And see you in the next one. Thank you.
Pleasure.